Okay. Oh my gosh. Yeah, well that's for you. That's amazing.
This is like
Okay, hello, good evening everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm Kara Carmack, the Assistant Director of Exhibitions and Public Programs at the New York Studio School, and I'm honored to welcome you to our Fall 2023 Evening Lecture Series and this evening's discussion on the friendship between Jack Tworkov and Yayoi Kusama. A reminder to those here on 8th Street to please silence your cell phones during tonight's event. We'll reserve time at the end for a Q&A with the audience. For those in the room, please raise your hand and I'll bring the microphone to you so our online audience can hear your question. And for our Zoom audience, you can submit your questions by clicking on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Following the lecture, please join me and our guests downstairs in the clay room for light refreshments and to continue the conversation. The New York Studio School is grateful to the following funders for their support of the 23-24 Evening Lecture Series: the National Endowment for the Arts, the New York State Council on the Arts, the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs in partnership with the City Council, the Robert Lehman Foundation, the Samuel H. Kress Foundation, and many generous individual contributors. Please visit our website to learn more or to make a donation to help keep programs like our Evening Lecture Series free. Now I'm delighted to introduce our guest this evening. Jason Andrew is the founding partner at Artist Estate Studio, LLC, the entity that manages the estates of Jack Tworkov and Elizabeth Murray, among others. He's the editor of the catalogue raisonné of works by Jack Tworkov, and over the past 20 years, he's organized historic exhibitions and published extensively on the life and work of the artist. He's the founding director of the nonprofit Norte Mar, celebrating its 20th anniversary next year. Congratulations. And is the proud owner with his husband, Norman, of the Au Sable Theater in Au Sable Forks, New York. Dr. Midori Yamamura is the Alcaly Bodian Distinguished CUNY Scholar in the Advanced Research Collaborative at CUNY Graduate Center and the Associate Professor of Art History in the Department of Art at CUNY Kingsborough. She's the author of Yayoi Kusama, Inventing the Singular from MIT Press in 2015, and co-editor and a contributor to Visual Representations of the Cold War and Postcolonial Struggles, Arts in East and Southeast Asia from Routledge in 2021. Her current research focuses on contemporary Asian art and eco-criticism, trying also to establish a zero-waste movement at CUNY, which is wonderful. So thank you both, and thank you all for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone. Welcome to the Halloween edition of the lecture series. I'm Jason Andrew, and Midori is sitting to the right of me. I'm really excited to be here. This has been an ongoing gestation of communication between Midori and myself. We met after your boxing match, your boxing class in Dumbo in 2018,
Right.
I think.
And then we first spoke while I was traveling back to Japan at the airport on the phone.
So this has been an ongoing thing.
Yes.
Midori is a distinguished scholar, and her research contributed greatly to support the kind of research that I have been doing with Jack Tworkov. So I guess you could say that our Wonder Twin powers united in order to sort of create tonight's evening in brevity.
Yeah, and it was an amazing research which you did. I brought Kusama's calendar diary copies today, and as you can see, it's only like a day counter, and I only had like a line or so about what she was doing every day. And Jason, through the diary of Jack Tworkov, he really nailed down what exactly these loggings were, and who she was dining, and what kind of activities there were, and that was just so amazing. Thank you for your scholarship.
Oh, thank you. This is going to be a love fest between the two of us all night. Okay, so while we're dealing with these two very established narratives between Jack Tworkov and Yayoi Kusama, their friendship is something that's never really been discussed or researched, despite the fact that Tworkov's diaries and papers have been deposited at the Archive of American Art since 2009. So these comparisons between their journal entries and the relationship and sort of contextualizing their artwork is something we're going to be talking about more today. So to establish more concretely and understand more completely this friendship, I reached out to Midori in 2018, and we started to compare notes. And she provided much of the insight as well as access to her personal archive, which was also collected through Kusama's meetings with Kusama herself and the publication of your dissertation.
Right. It's not so well known, but Kusama's archives copy is in Texas.
Oh, okay.
It's a very unlikely place, but the University of Texas Austin has a fine arts library, and also Blanton Museum has all the Kusama papers. It's almost a duplicate of what you can access at Kusama's studio in Tokyo.
So Jack Tworkov and Kusama first met at a dinner party on January 6, 1962, and after that, several times, including summers in Provincetown. They forged a significant, if unexpected, friendship between them, the two artists, both from very different backgrounds. So while wildly spontaneous, Kusama was calculating and strategic. She recognized Tworkov as an established artist and respected thinker. Tworkov was drawn to Kusama for her energetic and fully embraced freedom. And although their careers looked vastly different and they took different paths, the philosophical and gestural strategies for each artist ran in parallel, as did questioning their prevailing aesthetic orthodoxies of the day. Tworkov had the mark and Kusama had the dart. So Midori, let's set the stage. Kusama comes to New York in June 28, 1958. Where did she land? How did she get involved in the art world?
Well, at the time, she really couldn't speak English, and I don't think she could understand English that well. So she started mingling into Japanese American community here, and especially those who could speak Japanese. And she was especially close to a man called George Matsuda. And in fact, she was later on like living in his apartment, which was the floor below Donald Judd's apartment around like 1962. So when you hear about Kusama, I think it's very unlikely that you would connect her with abstract expressionist artists or critics. But in fact, you found out that the first dinner she was having at Beatrice Perry's house, there was Clement Greenberg. That was an amazing finding, because I never thought, like, I knew that she was really like approaching to Lawrence Alloway, but I didn't know that she had dinner with Greenberg.
You're telling the secrets coming up.
Okay, sorry.
So you mentioned to me too in our discussions that she kind of disposited herself to and connected with the Japanese American community here in order to help sort of establish and familiarity with New York, and then found her way into the art world.
Right, and she really loves to gather information. She's like an information freak. So she knew exactly like which gallery was very sales-wise very good gallery, and I think her friend was working at Sydney Janis Gallery, and she asked him, when Sydney Janis is away, can I put my paintings on the wall and then bring my clients so I can sell my work through Sydney Janis Gallery?
These are some of the earliest images by of Kusama working. The one on the left, you were telling me, was sort of the beginning of the net paintings.
Right. And
These are all by Kenneth Van Sickle. He provided these images for us tonight.
And the studio was on the 12th Street, probably across from Strand. And if you are familiar with Kusama's biography, she writes about this time as like sleeping on the door.
That you can see in this picture. And also, meals would be a couple of disheveled chestnuts handed off to a friend, right?
Right.
It's very dramatized, but I think partly pretty real. I mean,
Seems like, yeah.
So meanwhile, Jack Tworkov was an established artist, nearly 30 years her elder. And he was already celebrated by Art News in 1949 as, quote, one of the most masterful artists of his generation. These are photos by Rudy Burkhart of the studio on 4th Avenue that he split with de Kooning. De Kooning had one part of the second floor loft, and Tworkov took the other. He was a charter member of the 8th Street Club, the first generation abstract expressionist painter. His peers were Willem de Kooning, Franz Klein, Philip Guston. And by the late 1950s, Tworkov had pretty much scaled the heights of abstract expressionist period for himself. His gestural paintings were celebrated for the dramatic flame-like stroke marks, and his contemporaries were gaining, he and his contemporaries were gaining support of themselves by the sale of their art. Didn't Kusama say that they were selling like hotcakes, abstract expressionist paintings?
I'm not quite sure at that time, but when like pop art came in, I think she was competing to sell her artwork as inexpensive as possible. So when like Andy Warhol was selling his flower print, the small version for $5, I think she wanted to sell her mirror ball for $2.
So while Jack Tworkov really embraced abstract expressionism and what was happening, he had really grown weary and even critical of the movement that he had feared had become academic. Tworkov did share some of the period's assumptions around gender, although his character granted him a unique sensitivity that distinguished himself from his contemporaries, particularly in his encouragement of women artists and gay male artists. These marginalized individuals were often his students. They also included friends such as Jasper Johns, Robert Rauschenberg, and Dorothea Rockburn. And later at Yale, Jennifer Bartlett, William T. Williams, Howardina Pindell, Chuck Close, and Bryce Martin, to name just a few. Tworkov advocated for these rising talents. Regardless of their age, regardless of their sex or race, he measured them instead against a standard of integrity, intellect, and perseverance. Tworkov then was uniquely positioned to take on the fiery and ambitious Kusama. So by 1959, Kusama was pouring every painting she had, everything she had into her art in preparation for that solo show she had at Brada.
Right, in October 1959.
Yeah. She really revered the abstract expressionists and, quote, she embraced, quote, the dynamic attempt to face the complexity of modern life head on, break through it to something new. So these were the things that she was seeing and embracing. Her first major series of paintings successfully negotiated the frontiers of the movement without subjecting entirely to the influence of abstract expressionism. And she would call this new work Nets. Do you want to talk a little bit about Nets, the title? And
Well, yeah, the one before, the small white painting which you had seen earlier is called Pacific Ocean, and in fact, I don't think she came up with the title Net until much later. So I think this repetition of crochet-like motif for her initially was more like her experience of crossing the Pacific Ocean to come to the United States. And she didn't come to East Coast, she went to the West Coast first, to Seattle. And I think that was an inspiration. So sometimes those paintings, the earlier versions, such as the ones which was owned by Beatrice Perry, had island-like structure with those net motifs. But later on, I think she started calling it net painting.
let's see.
And I think it was very important that it didn't have a compositional element, and it has an infinite expansion. She references her life in New York almost like being on the conveyor belt until the end of life. So it's kind of like repetitive, like every day, or like this kind of like rationalized life had been translated into those motifs.
I like to think the fact that she may have been taking this abstract expressionist stroke and actually turning itself back on itself. So you're thinking about, approaching this all over event that she's creating, but then looping and interlocking each of these painterly marks, which then subscribes a dot, because she would paint the back black or a color, a ground color, and then go in on top. At this time, she was also vulnerable to episodes of a severe neurosis, but she continued to paint.
Right. I think probably like painting is the way she could stabilize her psychiatric condition, which she says it's obsessive compulsive neurosis. And I have seen doctors like notes in her archives about that. And like someone like Louise Bourgeois also says, like, when she was creating these stick-like figures, which is called personage.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, she said she wanted to sort of like stabilize her unstable psychological conditions by creating something solid. And I can see that when she did a net painting, it really can make her focus on something. And then some people who had seen her working in the 50s at her studio said, she's a very fast painter. So she would paint like, a huge net like in a few days, and everyone was surprised by her speed. That's what I heard. But
So before Tworkov and Kusama would meet, their works would be hung in parallel. Like in the fall of 1961 at the Pittsburgh International Exhibition of Contemporary Painting and Sculpture at the Carnegie Museum, Kusama exhibited The West, which is the painting all the way to the right, and Jack Tworkov exhibited Break Number 1. Then at the Whitney, the annual exhibition at the Whitney Museum in December of 1961, which would be 1 month prior to their meeting, you've got the work by Jack Tworkov on the left and Kusama's work on the right. And this would be the first time that Kusama's work would appear at the Whitney, and the 9th time that Jack Tworkov's work would appear then. But for Kusama, these exhibitions represented a substantial achievement, despite the fact that the critic John Cannaday, in reviewing the Whitney exhibition, referred to her as a he in his review. So here we go. They're gonna meet up. It brings us up to this fateful dinner party, but who hosted this dinner party? This is the woman, elegant, stylish. She was the owner of the Grease Gallery in Washington, D.C., and she's credited with mounting signature exhibitions of a vast number of international artists in Washington, D.C. This is Beatrice Beatty Perry. And in April of 1960, and lasting just under a month, a note to to the current exhibition schedule we are in New York, under a month, she showed Kusama's work, and the show featured Kusama's introduction to color. These nets were colorful. The list on the right are the list of the 10 paintings, 5 pastels, and a watercolor that Beatrice Perry sold during that exhibition. And this is the Beatrice Perry that I met in 2007. And we she welcomed us into the house. I was doing research on the catalogue raisonné. We set up a time for us to go and visit her. She had amazing stories to tell, but she would only talk to me if I sat in the Kusama chair. And Norman was with me, my husband Norman was with me, and I looked and I said, no way. And she says, then I'm not saying anything. So if you look now on the 4th floor at MoMA, the chair, Accumulations number 1 is hung there. Jack Tworkov's painting on the left is one of the signature paintings called Crossfield that he began in 1968, and it shows this play with geometry and very clearly his gestural flame-like mark. Both Kusama and Jack Tworkov indicated or noted the dinner party. Kusama recalled visiting the Green Gallery the day before and then spending the next day at the Art Students League and then going to Perry House at 7:30 p.m. Tworkov recalled the dinner party in his journal, noting every single person. I'm going to abbreviate who was there, but it was a huge party, including Clement Greenberg, Ken Noland, Dorothy Diener and her husband, Ferdinand Mann, some lawyer named Schubert and his wife, who was the daughter of the Admiral Kirk, and a Colombian painter named Fernando Botero. Of course, there was also the fierce little Japanese painter, Yayoi Kusama. Evidently, Kusama had brought a copy of the Ashi Journal?
Asahi Journal.
Asahi Journal. She came prepared to hand this to him, and it seems as though, well, you actually brought that idea to the discussion that she knew Jack Tworkov was going to be there, and she came with the journal.
She's usually very well prepared person. It's like quite opposite of what she may not be capable to do something. So, yeah, I think she wanted to get his attention most probably. So she brought Asahi Journal and then another book magazine.
Yeah, later during the. Yeah,
oh, okay. Yeah. And when you go through Kusama's like diary, it's interesting. Like the day before, like her opening, she goes to dry cleaner to get her dress, which was well pressed. So she's very conscious about how she will be seen in the art scene here.
So this is a contemporary journal of art criticism reporting on different movements that are coming to Japan. Jack Tworkov's painting called Friday was part of a Tokyo festival there. Beyond this initial meeting, Kusama on April 13th invited Tworkov to her studio. And Tworkov accepted this invitation and, according to Kusama, visited between 12 and 2 p.m. And according to Jack Tworkov's journal, he writes, lunch with Yayoi Kusama at her studio, seaweed soup, French tempura, meat in a sweet soy sauce, tea. I was surprised at the lunch since I came to visit and I was going to ask her for lunch, exclamation point. She gave me a magazine that reproduced Friday in color. This is another magazine from Japan that I'll show you in a minute. Tworkov writes, I have never met a feminine figure, creature, that gave off as much physical energy and intensity as this one. Incredibly ambitious and hardworking, what I wouldn't give for even a small part of such drive. Here is the journal that Kusama provided when he visited the studio. And you mentioned to me that perhaps the way she obtained this journal was that people in Japan were sending her literature to read about.
Right, because she couldn't really read a lot of English yet, so she was asking her relatives and friends to send the contemporary art journals, and it's been like logged in the diary sometimes, and also there are some letters which remains in her archives that asks the latest issue of these magazines. And by the way, this Bijutsu or BT magazine is an art journal, but the other one was more like Asahi Journal is more like a public, more like broader, sort of like a news journal, but the article which we translated from Japanese to English was the particular section which they discussed about culture.
So the studio visit and lunch did much to establish their friendship. Kusama subsequently received an invitation to dine with the Tworkov family at their home 2 days later. And I asked the painter Hermine Ford, the daughter of Jack Tworkov, about this growing friendship, and she says, quote, my father's ability to see Kusama as a serious artist and recognize that her work demanded his attention must have been extremely important and meaningful to her. It also could not have been that easy for her success, even despite her successes, especially going up against the guys in Tworkov's gang. So the two shared a common struggle over identity as well. Both were foreign-born. Tworkov often referred to himself as a ghetto Jew born in Poland. The only time they felt that they belonged was in the studio. And their respective practices defined their identity against the prevailing atmosphere of American nationalism, which included McCarthyism in the 50s and the growing prejudice about the Vietnam War. later that year in November, Tworkov got I almost said email, got a letter from Kusama saying she was desperate to try to find a way to stay in New York, to stay in America, and she was applying to foundations, many of them, as my research, your research probably would say too.
Yeah, she couldn't, well, she was having about like 10,000 yen note from her father every month, but it didn't convert into big money, so she was looking for, after a while, I think Beatrice Perry had suggested her that maybe you are eligible to get some scholarships so that you don't have to look for money all the time. And I think that's when she asked Tworkov to write a letter.
Yeah, so this letter is dated November 23rd, 1962, and she writes, "I haven't seen you for a long time, although I have thought about you and your family and hope things are well with you. In order to continue my work in New York, would you be good enough," I'm paraphrasing here, "would you be good enough to give me a brief comment about my work? I appreciate very much your assistance in this matter. I know you're very busy, and I'm not certainly in a position to ask you for this sort of favor. I do not know many friends who are in a position to give me a recommendation. Kusama." So we've got the letter from Kusama on the left, and Jack was really amazing about keeping notes about when he got a correspondence. So on the upper left-hand corner, you can see that's when he read it. So that it was mailed on the 23rd, he read it on the 25th, and then just returning to New York from Provincetown on November 20th, Tworkov, he wasted no time replying to Kusama's request and responded to her letter on November 25th and submitted his recommendation to the Howard Foundation, a draft of which I'm going to read excerpts here. "It gives me great pleasure to support the application of Ms. Yayoi Kusama for a grant for your foundation. Ms. Kusama's work made a deep impression on me for its originality and energetic experimentation. She has won for herself a prominent position among the younger generation of artists, now gaining more public attention." The letter could not have come at a better time for Kusama. Increasingly anxious about her future, she suffered a nervous breakdown on November 19th. She was hospitalized on November 24th and released in early December. On December 18th, according to the calendar diaries, she phoned Jack Tworkov to thank him for his support. More recently, I discovered this letter that she wrote to a sculptor named John Gordon, who was an administrator at the Whitney Museum. And the last sort of P.S. She's writing this from Milan because she traveled.
Yeah, this is the time when she went to Venice Biennial venue in front of the Italian pavilion. She was supposed to be like a guerrilla tactic artist, but in fact, I think her dealer from Milan had officially sort of like booked the space for her, and she is very careful, so she went to see the actual site in Giardini in January 1966. And I think after that she went to Milan, according to this.
Yeah.
I never saw this letter, but it's very interesting. And just to add a little bit more about her nervous breakdown, when she was hospitalized in, I think, November 1962, she wrote a couple of letters to different people, and I think she explained what actually had happened. I wasn't able to find any of those, but there is a possibility that that kind of letter is coming out very soon because of her recent popularity, probably.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So one of the thing that drew me to attention to this letter was was sort of the P.S. at the end, where she's talking to him about you've kind of become really valuable to the museum. She called it living deeply in the Whitney Museum. She says, he didn't have a curatorial position, so it's odd that she would say, but when and if you show any of my paintings, please do not notice my age under my paintings, or print any catalog because I'm a woman and I'm not married yet, and this is a bad image that I do not want, and it will be not good for my possibilities, she says. So I mean, she's combating a lot of things there, but also we're learning more about how Kusama tried to define herself and control her public persona even in these early times.
I think John Gordon was before Whitney. I think he was at Brooklyn Museum, if I'm not wrong, and he was someone who was a jury of this, like a painting exhibition, and then Japanese artist sent some like portfolio to Brooklyn Museum, and I think that was her first exhibition in the United States where she showed, and I think
in the late 50s then.
Yeah, in the late 50s, and then I think John Gordon was associated to that exhibition, so maybe that's why she thought he's a curator at the Whitney. Yeah, it's interesting.
Their friendship continued in Provincetown, as I mentioned. This is Kusama's Body Festival, 1967. We know that she visited Jack Tworkov during the summer there. He had bought a house there on the west end in 1958. And Kusama visited him then. She may very likely have stayed with him. Not sure about that, but she produced this body festival at the Chrysler Museum, which was originally founded in Provincetown. You can see how performance-oriented her work moved. The dots moved into...
More like a real space.
Yes.
And, to the street, because I think this was the time when psychedelic movement was becoming very like a boom. And I think she was also treated by some of those drugs. And that's one of the reasons why she's staying still like in a psychiatric institution in Japan, because if you don't live there, it's very difficult to access to those psychotropic drugs in Japan. So, and I think she was a big fan of like Timothy Leary, and this was the time when everyone was trying to expand like their expressions through expanded cinema and psychedelic light shows. And she was one of the first ones who started psychedelic light show, but it seems like when you trace Kusama's exhibition history, she was going right after like Andy Warhol to make sure that she's going to erase what he was doing with a type of psychedelic art, because I think Warhol was very much into methamphetamines and amphetamines, that kind of like drugs, and she was more into LSD and more like dreamy, creative type of drugs. Yeah. And they were competing.
And performative too. I mean, the work, I think Tworkov would have found in this next letter. Is this the next letter? Yeah. This is the next letter that we have from Kusama, where she's empowered, emboldened. She's introducing this new color film called The Self-Obliteration. She announces that she has a fashion show that's going to take place at the new school, and she tells him that there's going to be that it seats 500 people. She asked if Tworkov might arrange for a kind of happening, because she started doing these happenings at the same time as Vietnam protests as well. There was a lot of nudity, a lot of painting dots on figures, a lot of performance.
There were like two kinds of happenings. One was like inside of the room, like, inside of the buildings, indoors, and the other ones were like outdoors. Outdoor versions were only for the public relation purposes. So what they did is really to call up all these big news agencies and try to promote the happenings as much as she could. And she was subscribing to the news service, which is going to collect all the news that came out all over the world and then give it back to the person. And MoMA has one file which is about...
It's like a clipping service where every time your name appears in the paper.
Yeah,
so
yeah.
That's amusing.
That's it. And then the amount of publicity she was getting from those outdoor performances were really so amazing. Like, I think MoMA's self-obliteration, the grand orgy in the sculpture garden alone had maybe 200 or 300 press, which was sent back from the clipping service. But the indoor ones are more interesting because she was using the effects of drugs and then letting people explore their own sexualities. So this was the event which really, I think, really releasing sexual oppression during the time of, McCarthyism and
Yeah. So she writes to Tworkov in this letter. She describes her happenings as a combination of cinema, beautiful dancing, a fashion show, and with a background of my own rock band. Then she says, my manager, Eric, will handle all of my business, which I think is amazing, going from the time she arrives in New York in 1958 to now, 10 years later, 1968, we have this fully emboldened artist. The last letter, we don't have the correspondence related to this, but we do have this original first copy of, this was sent to Jack Tworkov around 1975. Kusama mailed him a copy of the struggle and wanderings of my soul. This text was later edited and retitled Odyssey of My Struggling Soul, and then it became the standard autobiographical narrative of the artist until her 2011 Tate Modern retrospective, and that was when the text was re-edited.
Kind of like she started saying that the hallucination wasn't part of her art.
She starts to eliminate and edit.
Yeah, but it was kind of a little too late to say that maybe. But
so while their art took two different paths, Tworkov had the mark, Kusama had the dot. Their philosophical and gestural strategies still ran parallel. As Tworkov's brushstroke grew more and more analytic and abbreviated, he sought to paint himself out of his pictures, first through the repeated mark and later through the introduction of geometry, which slammed the brakes on any lingering threads of emotional inauthenticity. Locked into this technique, Tworkov shielded himself from his insecurities and doubts. He writes, "Can you accept a painting just for its marks, not reading into it more than the eye can see?" And then, of course, we had Kusama, who was embracing this totality and obliteration and multiplication and I don't know what else. That's your cue.
Infinity. Yeah.
Infinity. So whether the mark and the dot of both artists, they shared this, this voluntary ordering of chance. That's how Jack Tworkov described his work. And to end, I would have two quotes that running parallel to each other here. Art remained the very pulse of life for both artists, Kusama continuing to work today. Both of them had nearly identical ways of describing this pulse of life. For Kusama, she said, "What saved me was making my way blindly and gropingly at first down a path to art. And for Tworkov, he writes, "I'm not ashamed to confess that I see my work primarily, not merely as a way of life, but a way to save my life." So thank you. And I think we can open this up for some questions.
Thank you. Please raise your hand with any questions, and I'll bring you the microphone.
Hi, thank you, first of all, for this wonderful presentation. So fascinating to hear about their friendship. I was not aware of it. I would like to ask about Bokubi magazine, which was a magazine about Japanese avant-garde calligraphy that came to New York in the early 60s, was very influential in the Apex community. And was Yayoi Kusama aware of it? Was it perhaps even feeding her information on members of the Apex movement and such?
I read about Bokubi in relation to the artist whose name is Hasegawa, Saburo Hasegawa. And I know that he gifted the subscription to Franz Klein. So Franz Klein, on the surface, I think he says like he didn't know much about Japanese calligraphy, but in fact he had the magazine and he had seen it. I think in Kusama's case, she really wanted to become an international artist. So I'm not quite sure if she was using some sort of like Japanese sources at the time. She was more carefully studying about American situation. And this was really the time when people were talking that painting was dead. So I think she started with abstract expressionist, but she was like Reinhardt, that she was negating what makes it painting, like color, because white is not color, and then composition, because the all-overness of InfinityNet doesn't really have a compositional element. So, but definitely she had used some Japanese painting technique, which was the base of her training, and especially painting on the ground with black, and then working on white on the top, and then putting a thin layer of white paint at the end is very, very Japanese way of doing, I think, painting. They didn't have to use a lot of different layers of paints, but they could make quite strong effect by putting completely different opposite colors, like black and white. And then later on, she sort of like erased that gap with diluted white. So she knew some sort of like techniques, and I think that comes from her Japanese painting. But I never saw Bokubi in her archives, and I don't think she saved everything, but I'm not quite sure if she was very aware of that.
And I think we also, just to follow up with that, what you're saying there, before she came to the U.S., we know very well that she burned thousands of paintings that she was making in Japan, or she says thousands or hundreds, I don't know. But she kind of burned this history that would have been connected directly to maybe calligraphy, and wanted to start fresh. But I know that the Americans, like Jack Tworkov and his gang, they embraced that kind of history and lineage, I think. They kind of, the history of calligraphy and the mark making and that. So I think
And Franz Klein was featured on the cover of that Japanese calligraphy magazine. So
all those guys were desperate for press.
Yeah, well, also it just became very influential on that movement.
Yeah.
So it was really Japanese calligraphy who started to influence Klein, Kiesler, and such. So I guess my question was she aware of members of the Apex movement because of that magazine? And
okay.
was that maybe a bridge so she knew in New York who she was looking for, who she would like to meet?
Yeah, actually, there were some abstract expressionist artists who are visible in Tokyo already. And I've read about this from another Japanese artist witness, but after the war, they knew that the US had a lot of money and that's where the art is going. So I think some people went there. I don't think Kusama was that much influenced by abstract expressionists when she came here, because she went to Seattle and she was looking at Kenneth, like Noland, not Noland, sorry, some of the Seattle School of Artists, and earlier paintings look very much like theirs. There are some connections, yeah. But that's a very rich area, and I think Toko Shinoda is one of the artists who you should look into. I know that there's a scholar in England, I think, who wrote a dissertation about calligraphic abstraction. Yeah.
Hi, I just wanted to thank you for this fascinating conversation, and especially the personal details of the letter from Tworkov about the studio visit he had where she cooked him a meal and what she ate. I just found that fascinating, that she would go to that trouble, and it really describes kind of both of their characters in that moment. I was just curious, I had read somewhere that, seen some letters where Yayoi wrote to Georgia O'Keeffe, and they had a correspondence that was pretty fascinating, considering, you know, that Yayoi was here in New York and O'Keeffe was already in Santa Fe, I believe. And I wondered if you felt like there were any female contemporaries that she might have also had relationships with, and I'm curious, did she and Ruth Osawa's journeys ever intersect at any point? Because I find there to be some similarity in their work. I was just curious if you knew anything about that.
Yeah.
Do you want me to? You want me to take it? I'll ask you a question. I thought that Kusama had already written to O'Keeffe before she came to Seattle, and that she had told her that her plans were to go to New York, and O'Keeffe said New York is no place for a woman.
Right, and then actually she was invited by O'Keeffe, but she didn't go to her place, and then she explains in her letter to O'Keeffe why she didn't go in the length. But later on, I think in 1963, O'Keeffe comes to New York for an exhibition, and then she visits Kusama's studio, and it's been logged in one of the calendar diaries from '63. And I think in terms of like woman artists, I recently heard from another Japanese woman artist that she was really not looking at the female artists at all. However, I think she did respect to someone like the name escaped, but the Jewish artist who does black boxes, and she was in...
Nevelson.
Louis Nevelson. I think Louis Nevelson might have been a big influence when she started creating the environmental installation. Yeah.
And was there a connection or an intersection with Osawa?
Oh, this is what I really don't know, because I never saw her name in anywhere she was putting like notes. But it's possible that they knew each other, because New York art scene was so small at the time and everyone knew everyone. It's just probably she wasn't really...
Well, Well, Kusama,
looking.
Asawa didn't really have any representation here in New York. She's known for her time at Black Mountain College, and once she left Black Mountain College, she settled in the Bay Area without a New York gallery. So the fact that some of the work might make it to New York, she did do some designs. Some of her work does appear in like design magazines of the period, where her hanging work, that wonderfully woven loop that you're noticing, that you're describing, that those were used in these design ads for furniture. But I don't think they ever met.
Yeah,
But
I think she lived for a while. Asawa lived for a while in New York, very brief time.
okay.
I actually looked into that at one point, so I'm pretty sure that she was living.
Well, I'm going to go with your memory.
Yeah,
But I
not
also think that the
permanently,
overall conversation about Kusama too, that didn't really get into this, that's also in the actual full out writing, is her obsession with the Green Gallery and Richard Bellamy, and how that was the gallery she wanted to show in. It was showing the cutting edge pop artists. That's so.
And
her thinking
minimalist.
about abstract expressionism, I think she wasn't really. I know that we've sort of presented this idea that she was really seeking out Jack Tworkov more for his connections, and that Jack Tworkov, knew Jasper Johns, who was showing with Leo Castelli, and she could show with Castelli Gallery maybe. I mean, these are all kind of other ideas.
I've seen his name in her diary to Castelli's name, but I think she really understood that Jack Tworkov understood what she was doing. I think she has a very good, feelings to those who were making good artworks. Like she liked Joseph Cornell because I think he was very down to earth and not really so pomp, whereas I'm not quite sure if she really liked Andy Warhol, because she was so competitive with him. Yeah, but Ruth Asawa is someone I've read the catalogue, and I think around 57 or 58, she was in New York, and I was always wondering if they
Maybe
were
that was when I
Yeah.
remember the designs that she was making for the magazines.
Okay, yeah. So sorry about not being very clear. Yeah.
Thank you so much. There is one burning question, which is, did you sit in the chair?
Well, in order for me to talk to B.D. Perry, I had to sit in the chair, and I tell you, it was not as wonderful. The condition was different when I sat in the chair. It was a used chair. It was something she sat. It was something that she used. It was not It wasn't a decorative sculpture that no one sat in. It was clearly dusty and used.
Yeah, I heard.
No, because it had all those penises popping up everywhere. And I think that she wanted to see my reaction. I think she was judging my reaction by what this would mean.
Yeah, Betty Perry's son told me that when he started dating with a new girl, he always brought her to the studio, to their house, and then let them sit on the chair.
Chairs.
Yeah. And it used to be placed in the foyer of their house.
Oh, it was kind of like the first thing you see when you walk right into the living space. It's right there. Yeah,
Right.
yeah.
Yeah.
I have a two-part question. So my first question is about Yayoi Kusama, and she immigrated to the U.S. How old was she? Did she have family already living in the U.S.? Because when you come from another country, you need that type of security in that sense. I was just curious because it was mentioned earlier in the lecture.
Yeah, she came to Seattle in 1957, and she didn't have any family members, but there was a Nagano prefecture, that's where she's from, a group that were supporting each other, like, the immigrant coming from her same area in Japan. So I think
What
she
part of
made-
Japan?
It's called Nagano. That's where like Winter Olympics was held in 1997, I think. Yeah.
Does she have children? Does Jack have kids or
I'm
marriages?
not quite
or-
sure about
I was
her
just curious.
sexuality. Yeah,
Ah,
she
yeah.
may not be a straight. She remained unmarried,
Ah.
but when she discusses about her phallic sculptures, she says, "I was so afraid of pennies that she had to make it." And that means like she doesn't have a normal sexuality, and she reads all these Freud and other. She talks about Karen Horney as a good like psychoanalyst analyst because she's a woman, and I'm sure she also read like Freud, and it seems like there's a suggestion that she wasn't a very straightforward. She didn't have a straightforward sexuality, and that may be the reason why later on, after 1967, when she started making happenings, there were indoor happenings. I've heard about some gay people from New York that this was really the place to go because they were so oppressed sexually, and she was kind of like liberating.
It was a sexual revolution at that point. I remember that.
Jack, and to answer your question about Jack Tworkov, he had two daughters, one of which is here in the audience, Hermine Ford. So that answers that question.
What did Jack think of her performance work and the shift away from the nets? Do we have record of that?
There's no written record of that. But I do feel like in order, Jack kept, he had the pulse of the New York art world, especially when he went to Yale in 1964. We started in 63 and finished in 69, and those Yale years are like the best, they're kind of the best of the greatest hits of artists that have come through Yale. But one thing that Jack did during that time was he reintroduced the visiting artist program. So Jack is in New York and in Yale and in Provincetown, and he's meeting young artists who can go up and teach, like Alex Katz, like Rauschenberg. So he's very much aware of what's going on in the art world. I know he would have been amused by the extent that Kusama took her work, that she took this mark and then saw it through in other ways. He talks a lot about that embrace of freedom. He wishes he could have just an ounce of that freedom because he was the painter. And I don't know, Hermine, do you want to say something about that?
I think that's very accurate. I think he really admired and supported work that was extremely different from his own. Knowing that he couldn't go down those paths himself, but he was all interested and curious about them.
You think about how supportive he was of John Cage, of Merce Cunningham,
Right.
all of those, very experimental, artists, musicians, choreographers. Yeah.
We have one final question. Sure.
Hello. I just wanted to ask about the Gutai artists in Japan and what maybe she knew about them and any influence back and forth.
They knew each other, and Gutai's Yoshiwara, there was a letter remaining in Gutai archive saying that I met Kusama in 1965 at Stedelijk Museum in Amsterdam. They were in the same exhibition called Null, and he said, I can't stand that woman.
because there's so much of a performative aspect in that work as well. And, you know, after the war, there's this sort of experimentation with destroying the painting and
Creating something.
Exactly.
I think that's what is called like infinity. That infinity is something which you will like create something that is outside of what already existed. And I do think like Jackson Pollock was a big influence on Gutai because they all knew about Pollock and they tried to create something that never existed before. In Kusama's case, I'm not quite sure if she knew Gutai when she came to, before she came to New York, but I think Jiro Yoshiwara was already like showing at Carnegie International in the same exhibition where she was showing, and I think some Gutai members were in this New Forms, New Media exhibition that really explored things outside of established art until then, and the Gutai members were in there too, so I think she was very aware. And that's why when she met Yoshiwara, she was being very mean, and he couldn't really stand her, I think.
And then on the Jack Tworkov side of that, in October of 1958, this was part of our extensive research. We could only publish, something like 4,000 words, but there's a lot of branches here. There's Jack Tworkov's connection to Japan and the Gutai movement. Yoshihara, who is the founder of the Gutai movement, came to Jack Tworkov's studio. What was the name of the woman artist that was with him? Katsura.
Yuki Katsura, yeah.
So there's photographs of them.
Her,
there's
yeah.
photographs of them together in his studio on the Bowery, dated October '58, and this is in advance of this great show that Martha Jackson was going to put on the Gutai movement. So his studio was never. It might sound like his studio was like an open book, like anybody could come in. He was very protective of his time, like all of these artists were, but there were these moments where he could feel this pulse of energy that he could tap into his and bring that into the studio, I think.
Yeah, and then you have a nice picture here.
I do.
Yeah, too bad. It wasn't in the slide.
It
but
wasn't in the slide.
yeah.
We couldn't go there. We didn't have enough time. Next time.
Next time. Thank you so much, Jason. Thank you, Midori.
Thank you. If you would like to read the full article, you can go to jacktworkov.org, and to contact Midori, your email's there, and my email's there too. Thank you.
Thank you. And please join us downstairs for refreshments and to continue the conversation.